What's up, you guys? Ras Atiat here in Singapore, and thank you so much for joining me back on my Night Owl podcast. I can't tell you what it means to me to have you listen in, because this is my safe space that I have cleared for me to be able to talk about the thoughts that go through my brain, the theories that I've learned, the theories that I've applied, the ideas that I'm contemplating, the reasons that I'm suddenly starting to connect the dots on certain things. And so for the last couple of episodes, you've been able to listen in on what I think about the buildup of emotions in a relationship, how you try really hard to decide whether or not to say something or not, and then you kind of keep things to yourself. You keep saying no to yourself in order to keep the peace around you, only to start a war within yourself. And at one point, all of that kind of builds to this big crescendo moment where you kind of break down or end up breaking up with someone. So we were talking about the overwhelm that leads to the rant about how you really feel in the last episode, and I kind of want to expound on that a little bit more, because the ecosystem that is off balance is where we actually start to explore what went wrong where, what we could have adjusted when, and if it's even worth it to kind of let the other person know to see if they're willing to change a couple of things to improve the current situation. So when I talk about an ecosystem off balance, I'm pointing out all the things that are off balance. And when you point them out, how it sometimes seems like placing blame. Now, for some reason, we're unable to voice our opinions without someone listening taking offense to what we're saying. It's very difficult to find people who are able to stay objective as you speak to them. As in, I can't explain anything that I'm upset about without somebody feeling, put upon or immediately insulted by something that I said. So with that being said, I want to kind of dive into the idea that the buildup of emotions is important, right? It's a series of decisions that we've made to either say something or not say something. And then when we're not able to say those things, they kind of burst out of us. Sometimes we find ways to kind of let them leak out. And what I mean by the leak is sometimes you end up in a passive-aggressive situation where you're kind of insulting the person passively. You're making snide remarks. You're making fun. You're poking at the person instead of outright telling them what you're upset about and why it upsets you and what they could possibly do to adjust it. Mostly because somewhere along the way, they have taught you that any kind of feedback may not be well received by them, and so you have to choose your words carefully. But to hold your tongue is not in everyone's best interest, and not everyone can do that very well. So that's why I talked about the breakdown in the last episode, where the overwhelm leads to a rant about how you really feel. That heightened emotional state where you're yelling at the other person and telling them everything that they went wrong. It's like the laundry list of the things that went wrong. But when you get to that moment, you're going to upset the other person. There's no way around it, right? It's like, I need to get all of this off my chest, so now I've got it all on the table and we can sort through it if you're willing to figure out what it is that went wrong and how we can go about fixing the situation at hand. So when I'm talking about the ecosystem off balance, it's that laundry list that I'm pointing out. When I list out the fact that, you don't care enough to show me that I'm appreciated. You don't help me with the groceries. You don't help me with the like whatever the laundry list of things is, because I guarantee you it's a list of things. It's not one thing. It's many things and many instances of the same thing over and over. When you start to list it out, it often feels like you're placing the blame and you're pointing out how the other person is not good enough, is not a good person, is a failure at life, is less than worthy. Like, it could come out any one of a number of different ways. But the point is to actually get it out in the open so you can finally talk about it. Now, how we get to a state of emotions where both parties are kind of settled enough to really talk about this is another story altogether. But I want to kind of take a look at the fact that sometimes it sounds like placing blame. If I stand out in a group of my friends and point out the fact that, I don't like it how certain people treat me a certain way, if they happen to be a group of people that can be collectively described as African American or collectively described as female versus male, immediately someone in that group is going to be like, well, I belong to that category. Are you concerning me too? Are you blaming me too? Are you holding me accountable as well? Which means I can't effectively tell you what the problem is without you getting sidetracked by the language I'm using. But let's face it, we only have a limited amount of language that we can use anyway. Until we're taught better, until we're given the space to actually express ourselves the way we need to in order to get to the underlying issue at hand, I feel like we get caught up in the words a lot. And when we get caught up in the words, we tend to miss the point entirely. If I say, hey, you know what, you could have done this, whereas so-and-so did that instead, suddenly you find yourself being compared to somebody you don't want to be compared to at all. And now you're looking at it like, oh, well, if you like it so much over there, why don't you go over there instead? Instead of listening to the fact that I said you could have done a specific thing differently, and instead of asking me how you could have done it differently or how I could teach you to do it differently, you've gone off on a tangent about how the other person is not your equal, not to be compared with you, and why are you even bringing that person's name up? So if you understand what my meaning is, sometimes the ecosystem being off balance also comes with this side serving of a lack of effective vocabulary to communicate the issue at hand. And I wonder if there's actually anything that we can do about that outside of just spew it out first off, and then we go about picking apart what's actually been said and what actually needs to be addressed. Now, I also know that when we give up that laundry list of things that isn't working for us, that we're not happy with, a lot of times, depending on how it's being received in the moment, we may go so far as to add extra words purposely aimed at hurting the other person to get their attention. If you've ever heard someone be called stupid or narcissistic or damaged somehow or a toxic person, it's not actually to point out that the person is a terrible person, but to point out that the behavior is really that damaging. You're trying to give importance to the fact that you need this done and it's not being done, but you end up hurting the other person in the first place. So I feel like usually when we have a sit down and we want to get things off our chest, we have to have an understanding. We have to have ground rules to how we actually communicate with each other or engage with each other so that we don't get lost in the verbiage. We actually can get to the decision to be made, the discovery of what actually is falling apart and what could be mended, and then we can really put the relationship in the driver's seat instead of me versus you, as in both of us sit on the same side of the table and we tackle this problem together, instead of me sitting across the table from you and me attacking you and then you attacking me right back in order to restate the fact that you do have some worth. So I'm really curious, how have you experienced this? Is this something that you notice on a daily basis? And what would you do differently? Is this something that you realize that we kind of have to blur it out and then clean up the mess of? Or do we just keep holding our tongue and let it fall apart with no chance of repair? So with that being said, you guys, thank you so much for listening in, and I will catch you on the next episode.